Hi everyone, Heather here with astrologywithheather.com, and I am back with another really special video. Today I have with me one of my teachers. She is a brilliant medical astrologer and astrology researcher. Her name is Lynn Koiner, and without further ado, I'm just going to bring her on. Hi Lynn.
Hello Heather. You wanted to know a little bit about my background, or your audience might not want to know a little bit about my background. This June,
Yes, of course.
I will have been a professional astrologer for 50 years.
Oh, wow.
I am that old.
You certainly don't look that old.
I have Uranus in the 10th house, and anyone with Uranus in the 10th house, they don't like comparisons. So they're always going to do something in a different way. Back when I was first doing astrology, they were kind of the first ones to get into computers. And I used to always say, well, I'm the best astrologer in Silver Spring because I'm the only astrologer in Silver Spring. There came a lot more of people doing astrology. Then I had original techniques. I'm self-taught, basically. I got some foundations from the American Federation of Astrologers back in the 60s and early 70s. But I basically self-taught, and I always know when somebody's self-taught because they often have original ideas. I think it's important to get some type of foundation with some of the basics to kind of help you, but you really need to do charts. Back in the 70s, you didn't have caller ID, and people had what we call these creepy telephone calls. Kind of perverts would call you and talk on the phone, and as soon as I would get that, I'd say, "Do you have your birth time?" And they usually they would say, "Well, yeah, let me go get it." And then I would talk about their chart. And so I got a lot of sleazy people, gave me their birth data. One I remember went to jail for dating a minor, and he had a stellium in Scorpio in the 12th house and Sagittarius in the ascendant. So, so I started collecting those charts as well. But I've always been interested in medical astrology. So even back in the 60s, whatever was available, I started to study. Later on in the 80s, I started to join astrology groups. And there was one here in Washington. And then later on, it was becoming the president of astrology group. I'm president now of Annapolis, and I'm just hoping there would be people would rise up in protest and throw me out of office, but unfortunately, that doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. But I've done a lot of original research on medical subjects, even intercepts. But a lot of things I discovered when I was doing medical research, the intercepted signs, intercepted planets. And in the 1980s, I worked with a group that started the Amethyst organization that gave free esoteric astrology lectures at the Pepco auditorium. If you're a public utility, you have to let people use your auditoriums for free. So that was a really good thing. And then I was really strongly into the Alice Bailey esoteric astrology. I do have an esoteric list of articles on my website, so I'm not going to go into that now. One of the things coming up, I guess it's May 12th, I will be giving a webinar for ISAR, International Society for Astrological Research. And I'm going to be talking about Mars, the acute depression, the acute Mars dysfunction. And I started researching this. When I lose something or misplace something, it makes me insane. I mean, you could lock me up for a while because I go crazy. And I remember I had 3 pages of notes, and I said, I can't lose these notes. I'm going to set it by the bathroom door so that I'll know where they are. I'll see it every time I go in. When I went to get the notes, there was only 1 page. 2 were missing. And so I remember I had one of these metal index cards boxes, and I started, because I thought, well, I can't throw the computer across the room. So I started throwing that on the floor until it looked like a truck had run over it. And I felt so much better. I got that anger out of losing things. And I said, this is a great research topic of what you do when you're angry and getting depressed. And I worked with a psychotherapist who started the Anorexia Bulimia Center in Washington Hospital Center in the district. And she gave me she says, you have to be very angry to be that depressed. And what it is that anger is internalized, and that's what leads to the depression. Well, everybody gets depressed. And so somebody wrote to me, I guess about a month ago, but I wasn't doing readings because of personal issues. And he just said he'd been very depressed. Well, he had Mars and Sagittarius conjunct Neptune. Mm-hmm. And I know what makes Mars and Sagittarius depressed. And Aquarius is kind of the same way. Sagittarius needs a vision. They need to see the light at the end of the tunnel. They need something to work towards. It doesn't mean they have to do this. They have to achieve it. But they have to have a vision for themselves. And also, if you can't have a vision, then physical activity, certain types of physical activities help. There was a woman who, with Mars and Sagittarius in her 5th house, and she said, when the children grew up and left the home, she says, I had the empty nest syndrome. And she says, I got so depressed. And she says, so I started taking up at the age of 55, tumbling. And what it is I would say with Mars and Sagittarius, like bicycling is a good physical activity for Sagittarius. It's moving that part of the body that produces the endorphins that pull you out of a depression. So if you can't see some goal for yourself, some aspiration for yourself, something to work towards, then the physical activity will be the substitute for that. So, I wrote to this young man and I told him about Mars and Sagittarius. You have to have a goal for yourself. Now, usually with the Mars-Neptune aspect, these people aren't able to fight for themselves. You see a lot of humanitarians. The man who started the American Cancer Society had a Mars in Pisces opposing Neptune in Virgo in the 12th and 6th houses. And it was when his wife died, he, instead of getting depressed, he started working on the American Cancer Society, working on humanitarian goals. So whenever you have a Mars-Neptune aspect, sometimes you had a parent who sabotaged your own personal initiative, talk you out of doing what you wanted to do, doing what they wanted you to do. And Tiger Woods has that aspect as well.
Oh, interesting.
He wanted to do other things besides golfing, but the father pushed him in that direction and sometimes sabotaging his own, what he wanted to do. So with Mars Neptune, you can fight for other people, but not for yourself. So another way of pulling oneself out of a depression with a Mars-Neptune aspect, if you have a natal Mars-Neptune aspect, is to fight for something else, someone else. Fight for the disadvantage. It can be, bad school lunches. It can be anything that you can get involved with, a women's movement, whatever, that you can take that anger and direct it outside yourself. Because with a Mars-Neptune, you're not always able to fight for yourself. That was kind of sabotaged. I have a Mars-Neptune square. And in my case, it was very definitely what my mother sabotaged. She didn't want me to grow up and go away. My mother and grandmother had the same thing. I have a Saturn conjunction Cancer, and my grandmother was, I know you'll take care of me when I get old. And I said, yes, Grandma, I'll take care of you. And I did. I took care of her. It wasn't really that much of a problem, but I know with the Mars-Neptune, that can cause depression when you can't activate your Mars, when you're around people who talk you out of, do what they want you to do, but not what you want to do. And so sometimes Mars-Neptune does better with a group. Like in teaching astrology, having people help me set up classes and so forth is much easier than me trying to do this on my own. So there, if you just look at the Mars sign, that kind of gives you a clue of what gets you angry and depressed and what gets you out of it. Like I have Mars in Gemini. Mars in Gemini gets bored very easy. And so I remember being very bored, getting depressed. And I said, wait a minute, I think I'll write an article about depression. And so I interviewed people with different Mars signs, and I could get a lot of information about what made them depressed, but also what pulled them out of a depression. For my Mars and Gemini, it's a new idea, some new research project, or because I tend to be shallow and superficial, some hot gossip about somebody I know. That also perks up and gets me right out of a depression. But generally, it's boredom, a lack of mental stimulation. You can go down into a depression. Now, of course, there are people with clinical depressions. There are many biochemical imbalances. I have a lot of these. One of the ones that just to be one kind of major one. If somebody is having severe depression or even a psychosis, I always love to go to the Edgar Cayce readings. And there was a book by Kirkpatrick. He did a big biography on Edgar Cayce. And one of the things, there were some, one of the people from the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, he wrote to Edgar Cayce about severe depression. And Cayce said, and this came up a lot, that he had a fall when he was much younger that had misaligned the spine, which put pressure on a nerve that was affecting the brain and causing this severe depression. And so it's just, so sometimes if I had a child with severe depressions, I would take them for a chiropractic alignment just to make sure that wasn't it. There can be other things, but just my first line of defense, and there's nothing astrologically that I can find that says, oh, this is what it is. It's just the first line of defense. There was one famous story where Edgar Cayce was giving a lecture. I think it was in New York, and he was talking about a young man who was suddenly just developed a psychosis and was in a mental institution. And his family came to Edgar Cayce, and Edgar Cayce talked about this injury to his spine. If you did an adjustment, he would be perfectly normal. Oh, wow. And when Cayce told this story, this man stood up and said, what he is saying is absolutely true, because I am that man.
Wow.
Back in Cayce's times, they did osteopaths. I don't think osteopaths do spinal adjustments anymore, but it was recommended that he go to an osteopath. There are many other things that one can do, but that's the one that's I say with my first line of defense is go have a spinal adjustment. Talk to a chiropractor about what would be affecting, what part of your spine would be affecting the brain. There are other things that are very simple. You know, I teach the courses, and the latter courses are on the lobes of the brain. And so any imbalance of these biochemical stimulants can cause depression. And one of them, with Neptune going into Pisces, that has a greater effect on the occipital lobe of the brain, which is in the very back. And that is where you get serotonin produced. So there can be a type of loss of faith. The occipital has to do with, it's the water, it's ruled by Pisces. And it's the water element. And when it's functioning properly, you think of all the good things about water signs. You have faith, you just kind of intuitively, you go with the flow, everything is going to be okay. But when it's not, you have a sense of hopelessness. You get discouraged, you get depressed. And also, because it's where serotonin is produced, most serotonin is stored in the stomach. So sometimes when there are digestive disorders, that's one of the things to consider. Serotonin and things that stimulate serotonin that may help with the stomach. So that's one of the things that can lead to depression or a loss of hope or faith in the future, would be the occipital lobe of the brain.
Okay, that's all very, very interesting. And I actually have a question for you.
Okay.
So I took your webinar last time around about the dysfunctional Mars and depression. And some of my viewers know that my background is in clinical psychology. So I found this to be incredibly interesting and very, very accurate. in the chart. But one thing that I noticed is that the aspects that you're talking about with Mars or the Mars placements in terms of depression could, at least in my viewpoint and in my experience, be applicable to sun signs as well. So if somebody's sun was in the sign of Sagittarius, they might need something similar to Mars. Is that correct?
You know, it's true. I think on my website, and I give it out to beginning students about you have to fulfill the ideal of your sun sign. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it can cause maybe health problems. Okay. And say a sun in Aries who isn't into adventures and doing new things, grabbing the bull by the horns and, let's go do something. Let's have an adventure. If you find an Aries who is repressed, is afraid of change, who doesn't like to try new things, then that's going to lead to health problems. You have to really be true to your sun sign. Now, Virgo is always a problem because we can get ourselves into health issues through feeling depressed, putting ourselves down, sensing that we're a failure. But having that mental organization and being of service to one's fellow man, that's also something that Virgo can do to kind of be healthy, because feeling useful. I know it's if people would call me and say, "Oh, can you help me?" It's like I'd perk up and, yes, I'll be glad to help you. Feeling useful is very important for a Virgo, but a doormat and letting other people take advantage of you, that can lead to what I call Virgo burnout. Mm-hmm. I think there's an article on that on my website. And, many years ago when I wrote that, Donna Cunningham, I just loved her. She saw the article. She said, it was about trans Pluto. We won't go into all of that. She says, Lynn, if you could just translate that to Virgo, that's an excellent article. So I went back and kind of translated this and took out some technical things and just applied it to Virgo. But Virgo, it's really true service to one's fellow man and doing something that you enjoy, not that you're dragged into. Because people who don't have a sense of boundaries, I say you'll get cockroaches. A neighbor got weevils in her home. That's the first thing that happens when you don't have boundaries. Because I have a young neighbor, she got weevils. They came in with something. Who gets weevils? I don't even know what a weevil looks like. And I told her, I said, do you have boundary issues with your family? And she says, yes, she can't say no because she loves her niece. And they're always using the niece to kind of get it. I said, you have to start saying no and not allowing them to manipulate. Because then if after the weevils, then a boundary issue can be skin problems like rosacea, candida, internal parasites. And if worse comes to worse, then it can be skin cancer. I said, better stop with the weevils and start saying no. And she started to say no to her family. And she says, last week I found one dead weevil. And I said, that means you're learning to say no. Because if you don't have boundary issues, especially for a Virgo or a Pisces, then your body senses this and it will do things. It won't have that sense of boundaries, and you can get into health problems.
That's so interesting. Wow. Okay. That is interesting. So something that you have written about on your website is inconjunctions, which you use very heavily, and I also use very heavily. I have Ellen Epstein's book, The Psychodynamics of Inconjunctions.
My favorite, yes.
It's excellent, excellent information. But you talked about Saturn inconjunctions and boundary issues. And so I have a Saturn inconjunction in my chart to my natal moon and my natal Venus. And so what's interesting about what you're just saying is that right before I read that article and started to realize that I had these boundary issues, it just kind of all clicked in my head why I was having so many problems. We had a cockroach issue that was like horrible. Like I have never seen it was in Texas. There's a lot of cockroaches there.
Testimonial, yes. So,
yeah.
So once you get that, then you have to start saying no. And I consider the inconjunction, that's a 150-degree aspect, which I allow wider orbs as long as they're in the inconjuncting signs, which would be like Aries and Scorpio. Aries and Virgo, they would be inconjuncting signs. You can allow wide orbs because the signs are really in conflict, but they act as a major aspect. And what Alan Epstein did was he gave the talents having to do with that inconjunct. And over the years doing readings, when I would tell people about the talents, that's exactly what they were doing in their professional and personal life. So I know it's not that hard to work with your inconjunct. It's just sometimes difficult because these are aspects that don't really work together. And when I would teach, I would say, I had this big rabbit. And I said, it's like your parents telling you that if you want to turn the lights on in the ceiling, you pull the ear of the rabbit. And for years, you start pulling it and nothing happens. Then one day you bump against the wall and the lights go on and you figure out this is what turns the light on, not the rabbit. So that's kind of how it works. It's like you were told things that aren't true. With Saturn, it does have a lot of boundary issues because sometimes responsibilities were placed upon you very early on. On my website, I do have a little article that really comes from Alan's book, and he told me I could use anything I wanted. And it talks about all the dysfunctional Saturn issues that come up with those inconjuncts. Responsibilities put on your shoulders too early in life, so you don't know how much do I really have to do. And learning to say no is very, very important, because with the inconjunct, that's an aspect. If you don't resolve it, it can affect your health.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, that makes complete sense. And one of the things that you talked about in that article with the Saturn in conjunction was, chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia. And we talked about this because I did a medical astrology course, but I had chronic fatigue syndrome throughout pretty much most of my 20s. And it was only recently in the past couple of years that everything has been resolved. And that was actually during my Saturn return when I was really asserting boundaries. And I mean, there was a lot of other stuff going on in the astrology as well, but that was one of the big things that I feel like really helped me, that and strengthening my Mars. Because we're talking about Mars dysfunction. My Mars is so severely debilitated. It's in Aries, but it's retrograde. It's in an inconjunction. It's squaring Neptune. It's squaring Chiron. It's in opposition to Mercury. So that webinar that you're doing, again, in just a couple of weeks, it was absolutely just super brilliant and very, very helpful in figuring out what the heck to do with this debilitated Mars.
It can be a problem because I know there are astrological signatures for diseases or rulerships of the body part, but that's not always the signature of the disease. I was giving a lecture in Slovenia, and one person says, well, the thyroid is ruled by Mercury and Taurus, and of course Venus. And I said, yes, but that isn't thyroid problems. The thyroid problems come from other issues, and one is Mars and one is Saturn, when these are dysfunctional. Actually, Saturn rules the throat chakra. In esoteric astrology, Saturn rules the throat chakra. And Mars has to do with will. When you suppress the will, when you keep things inside, that's going to slow the thyroid. So you're asserting yourself. One of the things, I always like weird things. I had a client who was terrified of telling her husband that she was coming to have astrology readings. She was just telling him she was coming for her a weekly social with some friends in downtown Silver Spring. And I told her, I said, you need, because her Mars was in Leo in the 3rd house. So she had thyroid problems, and she couldn't be honest with her husband. I said, now, there are 2 things you can do. You can wear an aquamarine right around your throat, but that just makes you aware of what you're good at. They have those little chips, aquamarine chips. They're not that expensive. These necklaces, they're just a string of chips. So you can double them up and put them around your throat. I said, but the strongest is going to be lapis, the darker blue. And I had some lapis I gave her, and one of these little hooks that can double it up and around her throat. And within, I'd say, at least 6 weeks, she just told her husband, listen, I've been lying to you about where I'm going on Wednesday night. I'm going for astrology classes. And he was just so dumbfounded that he didn't really react at all. Later on, he helped her develop in kind of the basement level of her house, a metaphysical center. So she'd been keeping this inside
Oh, wow.
for wrong that what a waste of time. She developed it, and he just helped her, set up and redecorate and buy things so she could have a metaphysical center in her house. And that was using lapis. It has to be right around the throat chakra. So usually the cheapest thing to do is get those necklaces that have all the little beads on there, double them up so it gets right around the throat. The other thing I'm always, when people want to extrovert themselves, I say sound and color is also something very good. Sound is what we call Ray 1 music, and that would be Wagner's greatest hits, especially Ride of the Valkyrie and the entrance of the gods into Valhalla. And I tell you, you start listening to that for just 1 week, and it will have you goose-stepping around the house, not taking any foolishness off of anybody. And I've seen this work if people are willing to do that. Ride of the Valkyrie is very short, so it's easy to listen to. Then you can add entrance of the gods into Valhalla. And people who've done that have generally transformed themselves. If you have boundary issues and you have people coming up and, can you help me with this? And you can't say no. You need to wear deep regal red. It's like an American Beauty rose red. If you go to a florist and you see the roses, the deep regal red, that's the color you should wear. Now, if you say, I'm not really good wearing red, I don't look good in red because of a lot of yellow tones in my skin. So what it is, you can go to Bloomingdale's or Neiman Marcus and buy deep regal red underwear. Others may not see it, but you know it's there, and it does something to help you extrovert. But generally, when you're wearing that color red, not Kmart red, but a deep regal red, it really sends a message to other people, don't waste my time. And I've even felt that when, like, a client used to come over and she'd be wearing red, I wouldn't go off telling a lot of personal stories and examples of things. I would just go right to deal with the issues, and then she was out the door. So that's something that people can do to extrovert themselves that can be very helpful. There may be other things you can do in terms of, there was one Casey remedy for depression. If you get lepidolite, and put it in your drink, you have a Brita, put it in the water. That is supposed to help with depression, because it's, what is the manic depressive drug? Do you know what it is? The old common generic one? Well, lepidolite has it in there. And you can order from the Heritage Store in Virginia Beach. It's water from this. It's lithium.
Oh, lithium. Okay, yeah.
It's lithium water, and you can put some of that in your Brita water. You don't have to put a whole lot. I'm not going to say if you have extreme bipolar that this is going to cure you, but it can help when it's a mild issue. I found a lot of issues with bipolar and the afflictions to cardinal signs. I'm not going to go all the details with that, but I know I was looking at some of the charts of actors who had bipolar disorder, and it's generally when there's hits to those cardinal signs is when it goes to extreme, and people can feel depressed. I used to observe back in the 70s when Uranus was in Libra and Saturn was in Cancer, that if they were hit, some aspects to it, people would get very, very depressed. And but I didn't know enough about Mars to say, go to your Mars sign and activate that Mars. One of the things with Mars and Scorpio, when I interviewed people with Mars and Scorpio, they would tell me, especially if there was a Mars-Pluto square, that would be that older generation with Pluto and Leo. And they often had the sense of being out of control when they were young. One of my students who was a lawyer, she says, when I was about 8 years old, I found myself hitting my best friend over the head with a roller skate. She says, all of a sudden I realized I could kill my best friend. And she says, I was so traumatized by this. She says, instead of getting angry, I get depressed. And the two things she could do was kill something symbolically. Usually Mars in Pisces or Mars in Cancer does this well, and that is go in your drawers with all your clothes, your sweaters, whatever, pull those nightgowns, pull them out and throw them up against the wall and express anger that way. Then you could just put everything back in the drawers and feel a lot better. Killing something symbolically is often very helpful in terms of expressing anger so that you're not depressed. And so she found that this killing something this symbolically really helped her. Just the water signs don't want loud noises. But you grab all your sweaters and throw them on the floor and use bad language. After it's over, you just feel so much better. You just released all that anger rather than internalizing it.
That's incredible. And the thing that's interesting about that to me is that you would think Mars in Scorpio, because Scorpio is traditionally ruled by Mars, you think it would function a little bit better and that they'd have a better way to express anger. But I have noticed, even my husband's got his Mars in Scorpio, and he holds things and bottles things up. He goes off on his own to be alone. He'll usually go out in the yard to do manual labor. So he's like hammering things and digging things and ripping things up.
That's perfect. But what you're describing is Mars in Scorpio.
Yeah.
They can easily pull things inside. Yet Mars in Scorpio, one of the things it is good at is fighting for the downtrodden and the underdog. And also with Mars in Scorpio, if you tell them they can't do something, that's when, by God, they are going to do it. I had a friend, we lectured, she was so short, and I said, I could always get Judy I said, if I told Judy that she's too short to get the book at the top shelf, I said she'd shinny up the side of that bookcase and grab that book and show me that she could do it. And so sometimes they need somebody to tell them, well, you can't do this. That's just when they get fired up and very determined to do things. But what your husband does, keeping things inside, but go outside and work in the garden, do something very physical, is a good way to kind of extrovert that energy rather than getting depressed. Although this one woman who was the lawyer felt that, she says, sometimes I just go and I listen to meditation music. She says that kind of helps me kind of calm down. Now her Mars was in the 12th house, so I don't know if that was really a factor, but in her case she found that listening to meditate to escape. And just to get away, to kind of withdraw, because she had so many planets in the 12th house. People with 12th house planets cannot be on 24/7. They need escape time. It was last month I went to Philadelphia to give a workshop, and I stayed with a 12th house person. I'm a 12th house person. We got along wonderfully because after we had something to eat, I would go to my room, she would go to her office, and we'd leave each other alone. So, because if we had to feel we had to entertain each other or whatever, we would go crazy and couldn't wait to get out of there. But we knew to respect each other's space. I went to my room to do what I had to do. She went to her office to do what she had to do. We could meet later on to watch a TV show, but that's it. We left each other alone. So needing private time is very important when you have planets in the 12th house. If you can't escape, that can cause depression.
Okay. And so we talked a lot about like all the different placements, or not all, but some placements, because there's so much to get into here with Mars, and how that can cause dysfunction and difficulty that can lead to depression. What are some signs that Mars does really well in, and some positions that Mars is really well in?
I don't know about depression, but I've always liked Mars in Capricorn. Now, they're more susceptible to gallbladder problems, fire signs and gallbladder problems. Fire signs, Mars and Capricorn, have to do with gallbladder problems. And my old astrologer back in the 60s said, with Mars and Capricorn, do not eat cheese or chocolate because the gallbladder cannot process these. I like Mars, and I guess all the Mars signs, they have good aspects to it. I find the easiest for me with Mars and Gemini is if I get bored, I just have to do something for mental stimulation. So if I'm feeling that's easier to resolve, then I just know Mars and Capricorn can be very successful in business. They need to achieve something, work their way up in business. It can be kind of a workaholic. And I know Mars and Gemini, it's just we get bored. If we can do something for mental stimulation, it perks us right up. So Those are only two I can think of right offhand. You know, some of them are just easy. Like even Mars in Sagittarius, physical activity like bicycling, that's working the upper part of the leg, can be very helpful to overcoming depression or kind of setting some type of goal. But sometimes you don't know what you want to do. And so you can't do that, but you can buy a bicycle and go pedaling around the block and using that upper part of the leg that's ruled by Sagittarius. And that works just as well.
Okay, so it's less about the placement and more about how you use that placement.
That's it. That's it exactly. You know,
Okay.
Mars and Gemini is just easy for me because I've got so much. I've got Moon, Uranus, and Mars and Gemini. So it's easy for me to, because I like to go for a ride. Oh, let's drive up such a place and meet some friends. You know, my friend Tina. Let me drive into Berkeley Springs and talk to Tina, and we'll talk about holistic health things. So I find it's maybe easier with Mars and Gemini because you just have to satisfy boredom. But if you're trapped, you can't get out, then it's more inclined to develop allergies.
Okay.
You can't breathe.
Okay. And then, so we wanted to talk a little bit about like retrograde planets. What about retrograde Mars?
Uh, can I do them one thing at a time? Oh, well, I can say Mars. These are people who internalize anger.
Mhm.
And it generally, when you have Mars retrograde, you come from a family who either repressed their anger or they were angry all the time, so you learn to suppress it. And in those families, you'll find, if you have Mars retrograde, you'll find somebody has Mars in the 12, somebody has Mars intercepted. You'll find a lot of family dysfunction in terms of how anger is handled. So there's a need to find ways of expressing this, because Mars retrograde can get into passive aggressiveness rather than speaking up and asking for what they want. And Mars retrograde has to find a different approach to expressing themselves. It can be through negotiation. It can be through, kind of talking about things in a general way, about what needs to be done. Rather, they're not really good at confrontations. When people get angry around them, they tend to shut down. So it's being around people who are cooperative, who want to give and take. But it's very, very difficult when Mars is retrograde, and there needs to be an outlet. And it's like Mars Neptune. Fighting for oneself is very difficult, but fighting for the things you believe in, like you have Mars retrograde and you believe in things, you're getting on your, doing little webinars and things and talking about things and teaching things, and that's a way of extroverting that Mars. My Mars is intercepted, so it's like Mars in the 12th and Mars retrograde. And so I really released a lot over the years from the 70s, 80s through the first half of the 90s, teaching at home. Talking about these things that made me angry, doing research, and learning a lot about myself. And I always tell people when they're studying astrology, the best way to learn is teach what you know. You may not know a whole lot, but there's a lot of people who know less than you do. And so teaching what you know, and that's also, a low thyroid can make you very depressed. I had, with the Epstein-Barr virus, I had chronic fatigue. I could barely get out of bed. That is one of the worst things.
Mhm.
And it was my dentist gave me Armour thyroid, but also it's learning to express yourself. I had not stood up to people coming and visiting me and being high maintenance. I just kept things inside, the anger and resentment. And then I contracted the Epstein-Barr virus from one of the individuals, and that affected my thyroid. So expressing what you really think or feel, but you have to do it in a way that you feel comfortable with, not in a confrontational way. Because Mars retrograde, sometimes it doesn't know how to express itself. You didn't come up in a family where people would talk things out, would kind of negotiate things. Well, what do you think? Tell me how you feel. And so sometimes things get blurted out or they get internalized. And so you have to know this is a specific problem for me. And so I have to be with people with whom I can communicate. Maybe some more air sign people who will listen to what you have to say, that you can communicate open and honestly to open up that thyroid, because a dysfunctional Mars, the first line of defense is the thyroid. It lowers that, and it as a result, the the furnace isn't working. So you're tired, and so you can catch things. It's not like you catch a fatal disease, but you can get colds and flus, Epstein-Barr, Lyme disease. You can catch a lot of things because your energy level is low. Okay.
Yeah.
That's Mars retrograde. I know on my website I have, there's the long retrograde articles. It's natal retrogrades. And on that website, I have, like, sometimes through the houses, people can ask questions, but I don't know how to change or update my captcha. I don't know how to do that. And so people feel they can't, I won't get the message, but I do. It may show up on the website, or you can write to me personally. It doesn't matter.
Well, I'll post a link to that article down below too, because that's a really good article. And I refer to it a lot. A lot of times, one of the biggest questions I get on this channel specifically, because it's, you know, a broad range of people with different levels of experience with astrology, but everyone always wants to know when I talk about retrograde planets in the skies, because I do these weekly forecasts, they want to know, well, what if my planet is retrograde in my birth chart? That's like the number one question.
You know, I have a little series of articles on my website under global gatherings, but I haven't really been updating it. Let's just do Mercury retrograde. People feel that you're not as smart, whatever, and that is not true. Mm-hmm. With Mercury's retrograde, you be a brood and ponder person. And it's very important when a discussion comes up and you hadn't thought about it, you have to say, it just has to be right out of your mouth, obviously this is really important to you. Let me stop and think about this, and then we can discuss it tonight or over the weekend. Mm-hmm. You give yourself brood and ponder time. You know, I'm working with some people here with my 1-acre farm, and I just say, you know, if you come at me with things, I may say the wrong thing. You have to let me brood and ponder, and then I'll come up with a good answer. Because I had a friend with, the speed of Mercury is very important, but you have to have an ephemeris. Mm-hmm. I think Solar Fire has, under reports, it'll tell you how fast a planet is going. And my friend had a very fast Mercury. It was about as fast, and she could just shoot from the hip and say things. But she says, you know, Lynn, it takes you longer to kind of think about things, and you have much more like a wiser response than I would. I'm just good at answering things very quickly. You know, it was a friend who said, there's at least 200 answers to every question. You just have to think one of them, rather than thinking for what's the best one. And when Mercury's retrograde, I will tell you, back in the, I guess it was the late 60s, when man was first going to the moon, early 70s, I had a relative who worked building the life support packs for NASA. And I wrote to a lot of these people and said, would you give me your birth data? And I collected a lot of birth data from those original astronauts, and they were scientists. They weren't, you know, pilots. They were mainly scientists. And I will say most of them had Mercury retrograde, especially in the water signs. Mm. So it's just that they would think about things. They would take longer to think about things and then come up with analyses of things. So it has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence. You know, if sometimes if people ask me a question, I've discussed it a dozen times, I can come up with a quick answer. But if I've never thought about it, I really need to give myself a brood and ponder time. I know what I used to be able to do, think and talk at the same time. Mm-hmm. One of my students said something about a Venus-Jupiter aspect, and my first response was, no, I don't agree with that. And while I was talking, mentally, I was going over what she said, and I said, wait a minute, I've just had time to think about what she said, and what she said was absolutely brilliant. I'll give you just a Venus-Jupiter aspect, especially a hard one. These are people who play a role at the beginning of a relationship. You learn that from a parent, usually the mother. You play a role, and that attracts a relationship with somebody who likes that role. And then you feel you should only do it for a certain length of time, then you stop doing it because you feel taken for granted. Then the other person feels you've changed. Mm. Like I even have a Venus in Cancer sextiling Jupiter. It's a favorable aspect. My mother would always cook. She was very Jupiterian, and she would always cook to establish a relationship. She would make a vanilla cake with chocolate icing, or fudge or chocolate chip cookies. at the beginning of a relationship. But then she wouldn't want to do it. People would think, oh, you like, and for me, I started doing that. I'd bake things. And I remember for an organization I belonged to, they said, oh, Lynn, you really like to cook. Can you do this? I said, no, I don't like to cook. I do it for ribbons at the county fair or for special occasions where I get some type of accolades, but I really don't like to cook. And everybody was kind of shocked. So you always, when you have a Venus-Jupiter aspect, never do anything you can't relate to. If it's something you don't enjoy, then you're going to attract people to this role that you play and not to who you really are. So just throw that in about a Venus-Jupiter aspect. The sextiles can kind of get away from that, but the hard aspects, the square, inconjunct, or opposition, they're very good at selling things because they can play a role to the people they're dealing with, PR, public relations. But that's not going to be a permanent fixture. If it comes to friendships and romance, they play a role, and the person is attracted to that role. Then they feel taken for granted because they don't like what they're doing, and the other person thinks you've changed. So that's how a Venus-Jupiter aspect, and then that can lead to, blood sugar disorders, playing a role that you don't relate to. And so that could lead to certain health problems as well, not major ones. It didn't affect my mother at all. She always played a role, but it didn't affect her. But it can lead to some health problems, usually with the sugars that are in the body.
And you mentioned before Jupiter and Mars being connected to blood sugar issues as well. Is that correct?
Yes. One of the things I noticed with Jupiter and Mars, now a favorable aspect is the signature of a writer. The woman I studied astrology with says that's one thing that shows up in the charts of writers. A Jupiter-Mars aspect, often it's really coming through the adrenals, stress on the adrenals. And so it really comes up as hypoglycemia. Or there's a book by Michael Platt that I always promote, although some of his remedies are a little old-fashioned at this point. But it's called the Adrenaline Dominance. And all the health problems, one being diabetes, hyperglycemia, that can come through that Mars-Jupiter aspect. But I see it a lot of times with hypoglycemia is really pre-diabetes. And so that's an aspect that can show up. What a hard Mars-Jupiter aspect is, these are people who overreact when something appears unjust or unfair. And I will tell you, I have that aspect. I will go to my grave and say, don't say anything. You're not, because somebody posted something on my Facebook, astrological Facebook, and she always just does snarky remarks at other. I said, I'm going to back out of this because it's going to become a long, all this dialogue and writing nasty things, and I don't want to ban her from the group. So I just didn't react, and it just went down, and nobody ever saw it again. So that's also the signature of an overreactor. I don't have arthritis, but sometimes an overreactor, whether you say something or internalize it, can cause certain types of arthritis. I don't have arthritis at all, so that's not one of the issues of my overreacting. I'm just trying to struggle to keep my mouth shut when I feel something is unjust or unfair.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I have a close friend who has a Mars-Jupiter conjunction, and he has this pattern of being like a whistleblower at all of his jobs and getting himself into trouble that way. Like he'll I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily an overreaction because there's unjust stuff going on, but he'll really make a big, thing of it, and it causes some issues. So that's very spot on.
What it is whistleblowers, that's a very unpleasant a road to take, because then you always get blamed. So, but there needs to be another outlet for this Mars-Jupiter, something where you're not a whistleblower, or you're not doing things to get into trouble, but making people aware of things that are unjust or unfair. And that's why maybe it's the signature of a writer to write about these things, to be a reporter, having a blog site or something where you can express this but not get into trouble. People may not like your ideas, but at least there's freedom of speech and you can put it out there on the internet. What's Mars-Jupiter in?
I'm sorry?
What sign is his Mars-Jupiter in?
I believe it's in Virgo.
Okay. But they have a lot of anger issues, and there could be some health issues that come up from this because Virgo can cause a lot of problems with also with blood sugar disorders. There's a lot of things that go with Virgo. Skin issues like too much acidity in the body can cause dry patches of skin and so forth, of which kali sulfate, the biochemic cell salt, is a good remedy for because it tends to sweeten the blood. But there's a lot of anger issues in terms of his personal life, being criticized and attacked as a child over things that he saw as unjust or unfair. And so therefore he has to release it out on other people. He's got to find another path for that Mars Jupiter. I feel it's very difficult to regulate because, you know, I'm going to be 74 this summer, and I will tell you, I will go to my grave fighting that overreacting. And all I can do is when I don't react, I can check it off. Oh, this was a good day. I didn't later regret. Because usually if I overreact and act on it, I always regret my action.
Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. So anyone out there watching this who has Jupiter-Mars conjunction, you know what to do, right? You know, find a good cause, that type of thing, instead of overreacting and causing some trouble.
One of the things is Venus retrograde. It doesn't. I don't see it that often, but I did a lot of research with rescuers during the Holocaust, and people with Venus retrograde very often can be born in this lifetime feeling unloved and unappreciated. I'm not lovable. Sometimes there can be, if it's badly aspected, you know, just parents can't relate to you, you don't really feel loved. But then sometimes they just come in with this. And, you know, I've had a mother say, you know, I just love my daughter, but nothing was ever good enough. So I feel that sometimes can be a very strongly karmic pattern that they come in with. And then it's finding ways to get love for yourself in maybe non-traditional ways, instead of buying love. Sometimes the Venus retrograde is in the second house. You could do things, buy things, do things for people to get them to love you. One of my oldest examples is some of people have to be really old from the 70s and the Wilbur Mills scandal and all the hookers at what was it, the Silver Slipper Lounge in Washington, D.C. And I had a client who worked there at the Silver Slipper, and she had Venus retrograde in the second house, and she would always fall in love with her customers. And she said, oh, he was so cute, he was so nice, I just gave him freebies. I said, you'll never make any money if you're giving freebies, and this is what you do to make a living. So that can be a problem. You don't feel lovable, so you don't feel you deserve. However, the good point about Venus retrograde is when the Berlin Wall first came down, I thought I just needed to go there and observe things, to see that wall coming down. And then I started going to concentration camps. At that time, they weren't, now it's like going to Atlantic City or Miami to go to these concentration camps. They're like tourist attraction. When I went there was nobody there. And I started collecting data of rescuers during the Holocaust. And we have the Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington. I pay a little extra, and then you get you can call somebody, a research person, and they'll give you the information you need. And I noticed, I think there may be only 2 rescuers during the Holocaust. That means their life was on the line, that did not have Venus retrograde. Even Schindler had Venus retrograde. So when they find that they're able to give love and appreciation by also, it's a very humanitarian Venus, towards directing love towards other people and helping others who are at a disadvantage. One woman who was not born with Venus retrograde, it's like by the age of 3, Venus turned retrograde by progression. But I have a couple of others I didn't see Venus retrograde. So it doesn't have to be that. It's just the predominance of Venus retrograde in these charts. Because I have friends, when they come up with, like, read a book about a rescuer, and say, oh, Lynn, look at the birth chart, they've got Venus retrograde. It comes up a lot in the charts of rescuers during the Holocaust. Because if you were caught, that was a death sentence. So it takes a great deal of bravery. I know there was this Lena, I can't think of her name, but she rescued children. After the war, she got these children out of Poland and took them around Europe and finally got them to Israel, where she gave up on her education. She stopped her education. And to take all of these children, I think it may have taken her 5 years to get them there because of the destruction during the war. And she had Venus retrograde. Obviously, later on, she was able to go back and get her PhD, but she gave up on herself to help other people. So it can be a very humanitarian, and that's a positive way of getting love and appreciation, by helping your fellow man, not just, giving them things in order to be loved. That means you're only loved as long as you're giving to other people, and that's not going to be very satisfying. But being very humanitarian, that's what that Venus retrograde, I feel, works the best.
Wow, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know very many Venus retrograde people, but the ones that I do know are typically the most lovable, loving, caring, like giving people. And it's like they feel like they're unlovable, but it doesn't make any sense because they are so loved, because they're like the kindest people.
They just don't register it. And I think it's something very karmic, because so many mothers have said, I just loved her, but it didn't mean anything. She just never felt loved, and I don't know what the problem is. It has to be something that is karmic to just come in this way. Yeah. One thing, we just have a couple of minutes. Is that right?
Yeah, we'll just go for a couple more minutes. I don't want to take too much of your time.
Okay, what it is there are some retrogrades that I tend to like better. And one of them is Jupiter retrograde. I tend to like this better. I feel it's more of the positive Jupiter. Mm-hmm. And that is Jupiter direct tends to, it can very easily play a role. And that's one way, if you look at it, if you know the Jupiter sign, if you're really good at knowing each year what the Jupiter sign is, if you meet somebody with Jupiter in Libra like I am, if you come across with a smile on your face, very cooperative, non-confrontational, that person will relate to you. So that's always how you can get someone to relate to you. Okay. But when Jupiter's retrograde, they have learned very early on not to judge a book by its cover. So therefore, they can relate to people. They can see, the good in another person, rather than the role that is being played. So sometimes they may be attracted to people who may not be the most popular. Because they don't judge a book by its cover. So it tends to see things in others that may be overlooked. And so there can be a very compassionate side. The other is Uranus. Uranus, when it's retrograde, well, I always say when Uranus is direct, like your intuition will flow like a stream, trickling out, just consistently over time. When Uranus is retrograde, things get bottled up, and then all of a sudden, eureka. So somebody who is very inventive and gets these eurekas, that's often Uranus retrograde. Although when Uranus is retrograde, you can look at the house that it's in. It's generally where you bottle up, and boom, you do something that shocks other people. There was one man who had the fourth house, and he got along with his relatives. Obviously, he wasn't crazy about them. Bottled up. All of a sudden, one day, he got a big blowout fight, and he says, it's been 10 years, and I haven't spoken to him since. So, and also with Uranus retrograde, they always see themselves as being very normal, that they're just very normal. And they're not. Uranus retrograde, they have to honor their weird and be true to that, and know that their ability for inspiration tends to be stronger because the energy kind of builds up and then it explodes. So I kind of like that. Also, when Pluto is retrograde, it can have the more positive side of Pluto. It can be manipulative, but it's much more psychological. So if you're dealing in profiling, being a psychotherapist, a counselor, Jupiter retrograde analyzes things from a psychological point of view, where Pluto direct can be much more in acquiring power. It doesn't mean they're like Lord Voldemort acquiring power. It's just like, I want to achieve this business and I want to, achieve certain things. It's much more external. Where Pluto retrograde is very good for, it's like a Pluto in the 12th house, very good at psychoanalyzing things. And so their power may come from being able to understand human nature. So if somebody, and it's retrograde like 5 months out of the year, so almost half the population has it. So it's very important when you have that to kind of, no matter what field you go into, study some psychological courses that give you a little more insight into human behavior, and then parallel that. Either going to be in the police force, then study psychology where you can kind of size people up better, kind of sensing energies. So that's another one that I really like. Having Pluto retrograde, I don't have any retrogrades. Having Jupiter retrograde and Uranus, Jupiter, those are the best, and Pluto. Mercury retrograde is not a problem. You know, there's pros and cons about, well, when Mercury is retrograde, you're able to function better. I'll give you two sides of it. One is on global gatherings. There's an astrologer in Europe. She says, my husband has Mercury retrograde. And she says, every time Mercury goes retrograde, he will buy something that eventually doesn't work. He seems compelled when Mercury's retrograde to take an action that he later regrets. However, back in 1984, Rob Hand was just coming on the scene. And our group in Washington thought, let's get together with the local organizations and have Rob Hand come. And he didn't do the, the old style of astrology, just regular astrology. And Mercury was retrograde during the planning. And she finally says, everything is falling through with this, having to organize this was Mercury retrograde. She went down the membership list and found everybody who had a Mercury retrograde natally, called them to organize the conference, and it went ahead without a hitch. Two sides of looking at transiting Mercury retrograde. I do have on my website the retrogrades. I think it may say for 2018, but they are updated for 2019. So you can look at that and see just what's going on astrologically. But you can look up natal astrology, natal retrogrades as well. So I have them both natal and transiting that you can you can print them out as you wish to have them. Okay, any other questions?
I think we covered a lot of ground, and I will post links to all of the retrograde information and to your webinar. It's on May 12th, correct?
Yes, for ISAR. And I tell you, if you're a member of ISAR, which probably most of your listeners aren't, it's free. But if you aren't, it's only $9.99. You can.
Oh, wow.
So it's not expensive to get this. So it's only $9.99 if you're not a member, and you just sign up, and it's like this. You get a link, you open it up, and I'll have everything on the screen. I'll have all the Mars signs and everything on the screen. I'll just scroll it down so anybody who subscribes can just go through that and see what I have written.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, I'll definitely post a link for that. I've taken this webinar, you guys. It's excellent. So much information. You're going to have to go back time and time again to really soak it all in because there's a lot. But thank you so much, Lynn, for doing this. This has been so fun, and it's been an honor to have you on my channel. And yeah, thank you again. I'm so excited to continue working with you.
Okay, I'm going to end the meeting now. Clicking on it. Bye-bye, Heather.